Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us to our second Climate Adaptation Seminar Series session. Today's presentation is from Dr. Mark Lubell, and it is on the collective action problems and governance barriers to sea level rise adaptation in San Francisco Bay. These webinars are hosted by the newly formed UC Davis Climate Adaptation Research Center. We are highlighting various areas of research done by our members at the center. So before we get started, I would like to just go over a couple virtual notes. First off, everybody is all attendees are in listen only mode. So we can see your chats when you text in the chat box. But we will not be hearing your voices. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can use the Q&A function to send a message to myself or Mark. Additionally, if you have questions for the presentation at the very end, please use that as well. You can also type into the chat box and we will respond there. When you are typing into the chat box, if you can change your to portion to all panelists and attendees, that will help facilitate interactions and discussions with yourself and the other attendees, not just with Mark and I. And just a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. So go ahead and share your name and affiliation, and if you want to as well share your interest in sea level rise and adaptation, that would be wonderful. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Lubell, who is the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior. His research focuses on human behavior and the role of governance, institutions in solving collective action problems and facilitating cooperation. Currently, his projects include watershed management, environmental activism, agricultural best management practices, and institutional change in local governments. Some research also reviews experimental economics and simulation techniques to further explore collective action theory. Dr. Lubell studies collective action problems in theory, lab, and field settings using quantitative and qualitative empirical methods with a long-term research agenda of discovering common principles of these collective action problems. Dr. Lubell, I will let you take it away from here. You are on mute.
Thank you very much. Is that still visible, the screen, or I need to reshare?
You'll need to reshare.
Okay. All right.
We can see it.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us today in this seminar, the second seminar in our new Climate Adaptation Research Center seminar series, and all my information is there, including my Twitter handle. I like to communicate with, do science communication on Twitter if you want to join the conversation. It's always good fun. So I'm going to talk about collective action problems and governance barriers to sea level rise adaptation, focusing on San Francisco Bay as the case study that I've been working on now for a number of years. This research emerges from what's now a group of NSF projects, which started with the RISER project focused on San Francisco Bay, resilient infrastructures that seas rise, where we're looking at the governance system, the transportation infrastructure system, coastal adaptation infrastructure, along with projections of sea level rise. That's with Mark Stacy at UC Berkeley is sort of my main collaborator, but I'll show you there's other people involved as well as in a second. Also, that we have trying to expand to lots of other areas. We have a research coordination network out of University of Maryland, Coastlines and People. And then we have a NSF project under review to establish the Center for Coastal Community Resilience. We're still waiting to hear on whether that will be funded this year or we're going to have to go back to the drawing board, but that center really tries to expand this type of research to looking across multiple regions, and also centering environmental justice and equity as a core driving principle across all the different types of research that we will be doing. These sorts of efforts really require interdisciplinary teams. So this is the RISER team mostly. That's my former postdoc Francesca Ventagiato and myself. You'll see a lot of research from us, but Mark Stacy and Samir and Michelle, they do a lot of civil engineering and the infrastructure and vulnerability analysis on the flood models. Bruce Reardon, Climate Readiness Institute at Berkeley, helps us with science communication. And then you'll see some stuff also that I've done with Matt Mildenberger, who's a political scientist at UC Santa Barbara, where we're looking at individual attitudes. So this is just, some of the members of the CASS that gets involved in these big interdisciplinary projects. So to be able to understand collective action problems in the context of sea level rise and diagnose the governance barriers to those, we adapt what is a framework developed by Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom called the Social Ecological System Diagnostic Framework. That's really a framework for looking at social ecological systems where you have a resource system. Get my pointer here. A resource system and the resource units, the governance system, and the users, they all combine to interact with each other and have different sorts of environmental outcomes. So this is kind of the ecological side of the system and the governance side of the system. So you'll see in a second that the kind of the engineers and the biophysical modeling crew, they work on this side, and then I work on this side, and then we try to bring it all together. So adapting this into the context of sea level rise, we have the resource units, which are the capacities of the infrastructure, which may be flooded or not, depending on different scenarios. And you look at the projections of climate change downscaled to understand how that's going to affect sea level rise in coastal areas. You have the resource system, which are the cascading effects across different sorts of infrastructure systems, and also how actions taken in one part of a watershed like San Francisco Bay, an estuary, may affect the hydrodynamics of waves and tides in other parts of the estuary. Then we have the governance system, which is basically the institutional arrangements that structure decision-making. And then the users and the actors, the behavioral aspect, the policymakers and the communities that are involved, that then interact in terms of cooperating, learning, and bargaining. They then, after they make these human kind of processes, social processes, they make decisions about what adaptation strategies to take, protection, accommodation, or retreat. And then that has outcomes in terms of what are the vulnerabilities, adaptive capacity, and resilience over time. And the collective action problems are rooted in the structure of the system, the biophysical system, and the governance arrangements and the behaviors are the way in which the actors are reacting to those collective action problems. So I'm going to go through some of the basics that we have here to tell you what sorts of collective action problems are involved with climate adaptation. And I'm going to spend a lot more time over here going through in more detail these 8 core governance challenges that we've discovered through our research and what's going on in San Francisco Bay right now to address them. All right, so this is the resource system. This is just one example. There's lots of ways you can analyze this, but this just gives you an idea about it, given the different types of scenarios for sea level rise, different centimeters of that you may have in the short or long term, how much wastewater treatment capacity is lost in different areas of San Francisco Bay. You can see some areas have higher loss than others, and that's one of the things that you have to think about. It's not just flooding of houses, but you have transportation infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure and other sorts of infrastructure. A lot of Silicon Valley, for example, which is at threat, and when it gets flooded, you lose that capacity. And then I think even more important from the collective action perspective is how the flooding then has cascading effects through the structure of the infrastructure and the resource system to create interdependency. when you have collective action problems, they're really the root of them is interdependency. And when I say interdependency, that means that actions that are taken by one policy actor, or it might be a city or a state agency or just an individual, they have implications for the actions that are taken by other actors. The benefits and the costs of decision making are interdependent across those different actors. As soon as you have that interdependence, it's possible to find some solutions that are sort of collectively better for everybody, or some solution or some actions that might be collectively worse for everybody. And when you think about regional adaptation, you want to try to find the set of solutions that provides the greatest mutual benefits and avoids the worst of those mutual costs. So there's really 4 different types of interdependencies that are important. One is what is called shared experience, and this is really more about learning and being able to share information. And this is a analysis that Michelle Hummel and Mark Stacey did, where you have different communities that have different types of socioeconomics and different types of infrastructure, and the fact that they're going to experience similar sorts of impacts from sea level rise. And because they have similar sorts of impacts, they could learn from each other about how to deal with it. So how do you facilitate the communities linking together and sharing information? This is what we call vulnerability interdependence. And what happens here is if there's a vulnerability in one part of the system, it has, and that one part of the system gets flooded, there's cascading effects across the region. And in this case, we're talking about transportation. And we knocked out Berkeley from flooding in this particular scenario. Since I'm from UC Davis, I'm working with people in Berkeley. We like to knock out Berkeley as much as we possibly can. So we flooded Berkeley and then looked at, through our modeling of the traffic flows, how the traffic impacts were regional, because people can't get through this road part of Berkeley. They have to reroute in all kinds of different ways. So it's not just Berkeley that matters here. It's actually the whole region should care about what happens locally. So that's vulnerability interdependence. Adaptation interdependence occurs when an adaptation action taken by one actor has implications for everybody else. In this case, what Mark Stacey and his team did is they simulated protecting the coastline of each of these different counties one at a time, and then simulated how the water would move from one county to another. And you can see, because San Francisco is kind of like a giant bathtub, if you protect Alameda County, for example, it potentially raises the water in San Mateo County. And so when you're thinking about all the solutions, if all these actors are working just individually, you may not be able to optimize the system as far as the mutual benefits. And I don't have a picture of it here, but there's also policy interdependence in the sense that the solutions to these problems are not emerging from the actions of just one agency or just one city. There's lots of different actors that have different tools and resources that really have to come together to be able to come up with a plan, to come up with the different projects and get those projects on the ground over time. So those are the 4 main types of interdependencies that you have to think about that generate collective action problems: the need for learning, the need for cooperation at the regional level, and in the context of climate adaptation. Lots of you probably know already that climate mitigation is a big cooperation problem, because we could just drive as much as we want or whatever, not do what we need to do to reduce carbon emissions and free ride on everybody else. But the same sorts of problems happen in climate adaptation, where you have to deal with these types of interdependencies. So the next part of the talk, I'm going to dive more into the other side of that system, thinking about what are the governance barriers that are rooted in the structure of the governance system and the behavioral aspects of the communities and actors that are involved. And to diagnose those governance barriers and challenges to climate adaptation, sea level rise adaptation, we have a mixed methods approach that relies on a set of interviews that I did, and I guess it's back in around 2017 now, where I interviewed over 40 people involved in sea level rise adaptation in the Bay Area, regional, local government, non-governmental stakeholders. Took about an hour each. Then we followed that up with focus groups in the North, South Bay, and Central Bay, where we invited those same stakeholders to deliberate on what I had found there and think about what are the different solution concepts and which ones might be the best. I wrote all of that up in a report called The Governance Gap, Climate Adaptation, and Sea Level Rise in the San Francisco Bay Area. If you want to kind of like get into what I found at that time, and I would say a lot of the stuff is very relevant in ongoing discussions. From that report, it's a good agenda setting type of report, was widely circulated among the stakeholders. We followed that up with a survey of all the different actors, which we're still working on, and the data on that for more academic publications. And I'll show you in a second some of the demographics around that. And then I'm involved in the Bay Adapt process, which is a BCDC's planning process to try to come up with a regional vision and joint platform for sea level rise adaptation. And so that gives me an opportunity not only to contribute the sorts of knowledge that I have about governance, but also to really kind of be in the trenches to see and watch how this is unfolding over time with all the stakeholders interacting, try to figure out what to do about these problems. Okay, here's a little bit of information about the survey. It was in 2018. We have three main parts: perceptions of the problems, preferences concerning their actions, and the sorts of collaborative activities they did. We got a 22% response rate, which is not great, but it's not terrible. If I get over 30% in these big stakeholder surveys, I'm pretty happy. But we cast a really broad net here, so we think we got a lot of people that are involved. This gives you an idea of the demographics of the people involved: local government, NGOs, consulting and research, people on their own design, state governments, agencies. So the kind of typical cast of characters that are involved. Most of them have sea level rise as at least part of their work. And then the geographic focus of who's involved. And these are the OLUs, the operational landscape units developed by San Francisco Estuary Institute as good planning units for sea level rise adaptation in the Bay Area. So it just kind of gives you a sense. We got a diversity of stakeholders from a diversity of geography who are working on sea level rise across the San Francisco Bay Area. And then as a result of that governance research, these are the 8 key governance challenges we found: increasing complexity, network governance, planning, permitting, funding, science enterprise, political leadership, and community engagement. On the left side are governance structural barriers. On the right side are behavioral barriers that are rooted in the behavior of the actors and the communities and individuals that are involved. And now I'm going to kind of go through what each of those are and some of the ongoing activities to address them in San Francisco Bay. So governance is messy. This is a picture. Mateo Robbins came up with this picture. I think he's on the audience right now, a former graduate student of mine. We just actually had a paper published on this network. But what this shows is the blue squares are different forums in which people are deliberating about sea level rise. And the red circles are all the different actors. And this is just like the small core of the network. There's actually hundreds of actors and over 100 of these blue squares, these forums. So you can see that these decisions are not made in just one actor making some uber decision about everything. It's this polycentric, messy network that you have to try to figure out how to coordinate across multiple levels: regional level, local level, city level, special district level. And in the Bay Area, we have a very fragmented local government system, lots of local governments, lots of special districts. In response to this graph, at one point, there's a veteran of California Water named Phil Eisenberg, who was previously the chair of the Delta Stewardship Council and the mayor of Sacramento. He said that on looking at these networks, he wrote, "Public policy is almost always a mess. Let's acknowledge the inevitable and figure out how to manage a messy situation. Trying to define a policy problem is hard enough. Trying to find a solution is even harder. Trying to do either in a policy-making structure in which everyone is involved, but no one is in charge, is nearly impossible." So that's kind of one of the, I would say, really the core governance challenge that you have to solve, to which basically all the other challenges are linked. Those blue squares I showed you, those policy forms for sea level rise, at the time we finished collecting that particular data was around 2016. But we did, because we're in California, we like to establish the vintage of things. So when were those sea level rise forms created? And you can kind of see it really ramped up beginning in 2010 as people began to really pay attention to sea level rise as an issue. And as those blue squares ramp up, more and more efforts devoted towards trying to understand sea level rise, you get increasing fragmentation and complexity, which requires even more effort at coordination. The Bay Adapt process did not even exist at the time we collected that previous data. So that process of creating new forums and planning efforts towards sea level rise continues today. So once you have that kind of messy network, what you have to do is figure out how to manage it or govern it. So the second challenge is you have increasing complexity. So how do you manage it? That's the challenge of network governance. And that term network governance comes from my field of policy sciences and public administration, where it's kind of a term to describe all sorts of different policy problems where you have a network of actors that need to work together, and how do you figure out how to get it done? So here's some evidence of this network governance problem from the survey that I showed you, the stakeholder survey we did. And you see that when we asked people about, how much agreement is there on the risks versus the actions, you see a pretty high level of agreement on the risks. That, in other words, people believe sea level rise is a problem in the Bay Area, and there's pretty good agreement on that, which is actually an advantage for San Francisco Bay, because there's lots of other regions in the country in which there's people who don't believe in climate change or think sea level rise is not a climate change problem, even if they're experiencing flooding. But that's not, we have the advantage in the Bay Area of pretty widespread agreement on sea level rise as a core issue, but we don't have a very high level agreement on what we should do about it. So solving the problem and getting the governance correct is where the issue needs to be dealt with. And then we asked everybody, what are the different potential things that we could do to solve this governance problem? And at the top here says, create a regional sea level rise adaptation plan, create a collaborative partnership between existing agencies and stakeholders. But at the bottom is establish a new regional authority to address sea level rise. So everybody wants a new plan, everybody wants collaboration, but nobody wants a new authority or somebody to tell them what to do. So that's kind of the trick we got to get at here, is how do we have a plan, how do we have collaboration, but how do we do it without invoking the new authority, a new agency, new sticks in the system that are going to force people to do things, because there's always resistance against that. Okay, so what are we doing planning? Well, we need kind of a vision and an overarching plan, and there's been various efforts at that up to now, but now the kind of the big game in town is the Bay Adapt process, and this is being led by the Bay Conservation Development Commission, which is a regional agency that has a long history in San Francisco Bay. It was set up to try to limit development and bay fill. So all the kind of bayside development projects need a permit from BCDC. It has a regulatory permitting function, but it also has a planning function. We can talk about, there's a bit of the planning and regulatory functions of that agency, give it a little bit of a schizophrenic character. Right now they're doing Bay Adapt. It's an initiative to establish regional agreement on the actions necessary to protect people in the natural and built environment for rising sea levels. And that it's literally in the process right now. It's being developed right now. I'm on the leadership group for that. So I kind of got my eye on that ball. This is what the process looks like. There's been a sort of interaction with stakeholders and leadership advisory groups and working groups. So it's kind of working on multiple levels over time to scope and develop a joint platform and get that joint platform activated, this is the timeline they have on their website. It's delayed. COVID definitely delayed this. It's an interesting issue. You know, we had lots of in-person meetings and interaction. We had to move the whole thing to virtual. So I actually think that you know, there should be some research on the intervention of COVID on the timeline for climate adaptation. I think it's probably slowed things down everywhere. And then activating this joint platform in such a way that whatever that platform ends up being at the end, that we are able to hold accountable all the different actors who need to do something to implement the different actions. That the joint Bay Adapt is proceeding according to some principles: collaborative, inclusive decision making, supporting socially vulnerable communities, because there is a big environmental justice and disadvantaged community issue in the Bay Area, like there are with many other climate, I would say all climate adaptation issues. Solving problems together, don't holding back early movers, because there's some interesting discussion of there are some local governments and special districts and others that are taking early action because they have good political leadership, or maybe they're experienced some flooding already, and we don't want them to wait for this vision or joint platform to be developed. We don't want to hold them back, even though what they may be doing could have positive or negative implications for other actors. Go green where appropriate. In other words, emphasize green infrastructure, such as restoring wetlands, over gray infrastructure where it can be done. Like you see in the background of my picture, the Embarcadero seawall is one of the most famous pieces of the San Francisco shoreline, and you're not going to be restoring infrastructure there, so they got a $5 billion project to try to upgrade that seawall. Then picking the right strategy for the right place and time, which means that if you look, for example, across all of those organized landscape units operational landscape units that SFEI, San Francisco Estuary Institute, has identified, they have different types of appropriate on-the-ground adaptation options. So that's the planning effort that's going on. Challenge 4, permitting. Let's say you want to put in green infrastructure on some of these operational landscape units or upgrade that seawall. Well, guess what? You have to go through a gauntlet of permits. So some of the permits that you might have to deal with as local government, the BCDC, Army Corps of Engineers, Regional Water Quality Control Board, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMS, and others. So that, and then also environmental review under NEPA or CEQA or both. And so going through all of those processes at the very least takes a lot of time and resources. And at the worst, you can have agencies that are giving you conflicting decisions about whether they think their project should even be allowed, or the different types of conditions under which that you should change, do mitigation, or reshape the project in order to meet their particular regulatory requirements. So that gauntlet of permits, getting through that efficiently is one of the things that hampers things. And one of my interviewees said, adaptation projects get treated the same as someone putting up a Walmart. We got to jump through the same hoops, and it takes years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get permits. So in recognition of that, there is something called BRIT now, which is called the San Francisco Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. And this is an attempt to do integrated permitting around adaptation projects, especially ones that are eligible for restoration money under a particular bond act I'll show you in a second. So what's cool about BRIT is that it takes all the different officials that are that you need permits for, which you can see down here, and puts them together in kind of a team that communicates and has a single point of application that tries to integrate all of those different requirements, gets the team to communicate, and tries to fast track that permitting without changing the permitting authorities, right? So you're not like trying to make it to reduce the requirements or change that administrative or legislative background for the permitting, but you're trying to help people understand how to best go through it, make sure the agencies are communicating with each other, and get through it as efficiently as possible. And this builds on another integrated permitting effort in the Bay Area around dredged materials, which continues to be a big issue about reuse of dredged materials for wetlands. And of course, there's not complete agreement on this. There's some people worry about this. For example, environmentalists who might think that easing permit requirements or making easier to get could run roughshod over environmental priorities. But that's basically what's going on at the moment. Okay, Challenge 5 funding. If you want to get this stuff on board, you gotta pay for it somehow. And we know, I don't think anybody's come up with a total price tag for adaptation projects within San Francisco Bay or anywhere, but we know it's going to be really expensive. Whenever I see an estimate of how much the price tag for coastal climate adaptation anywhere, if I add a zero to whatever that estimate is, I don't think it's crazy to just add a zero and think it could easily be another zero on it. So here's just a few price tags. So there's a goal in the Bay of restoring 100,000 acres of wetlands. The price tag on that is 1.43 billion over 50 years. It's probably going to be bigger than that in the end. For the first phase of the Embarcadero seawall, $5 billion. So it's really big numbers you're talking about for adaptation actions, but also the vulnerabilities. And there's, you have so much infrastructure and so much human population at the coastline that the costs of doing nothing are also in the billions, probably trillions of dollars worldwide. So where does that money come from? There's lots of different sources. One of the important, interesting ones in the Bay Area is called Measure AA, which was passed in 2016 with 70% majority. It's a $12 parcel tax per year to raise money for shoreline projects that would restore wetlands in San Francisco Bay and have adaptation benefits. And you can kind of see where they are. They've authorized about $100 million in projects right now. So it's not the full price tag, you might notice. And also it's really kind of limited to wetlands projects. So there's really no gray infrastructure in here. And you can see where they're spending some of their money: tidal marsh complexes, managed ponds and wetlands, the Bay Trail, public access facilities and levees, and some of the types of projects that they've been doing. And there's been San Francisco had a bond act for some of their infrastructure, and there's going to be a lot of local sources of revenue. In my view, as a matter of fact, the fact that even though California is a big state surplus right now and is spending money on coastal protection, that's intermittent money, and the federal money is intermittent money. It depends on budget surpluses, it depends on which political parties in power in Washington. So we're going to need a lot of more sustainable local sources through bond acts, special act districts, and various sorts of things that are going to generate sustainable revenue streams over time. Okay, challenge 6, the science enterprise. When you're making decisions about sea level rise, you want to know some basic things, such as how much sea level rise do we expect, in what time frame, where is the flooding going to occur, what are the adaptation actions that might be appropriate, how do you get them on the ground. And that science is, just like the decision making itself, is fairly fragmented. So there's an effort to try to bring that together in this idea of a science enterprise. What that science enterprise does is identify the best available science, but it's not just identifying the best available science and throwing it up on a website for decision makers at the local level or NGOs to click on something and read an academic paper. It's also building translational capacity into the science enterprise so that there's an actual human being that can translate the science into the language and understanding that decision makers need. And that's one of the things that's lost a lot of times, because people just think, oh, we'll just put our papers up and we won't do any effective science communication or translation. And this part really is not established yet in the Bay Area. There are some leading efforts, I think, like the state of California's sea level rise guidance is kind of the thing that most people look to think about what the different scenarios should be for sea level rise. And SFEI, San Francisco Estuary Institute, has done a lot of really good work around the science and is looked to as a science leader. And I really like their San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas, which has these operational landscape units, which I referenced earlier, and how much flooding you might expect in them, and the different types of topography and built infrastructure that are at each one that would lend itself to different sorts of adaptation options. And so I really like that, but these actors, while they obviously all know each other, there's not kind of a unified science enterprise. And that's one of the things we're aiming for in Bay Adapt, is maybe having some legislation that would set up a more unified science program in the Bay Area that looks something like the one in Chesapeake Bay or the Everglades, where they really have a highly coordinated science system. Okay, so those are the challenges around the structure of the system. And there's two challenges in the behavior of the actors in the communities. The seventh one is political leadership. So political leadership has to come from multiple levels. At the state level, the legislative leadership in the governor's office, administrative actions and agenda setting. Then also local elected officials, some of whom are stepping up. There's variance there. Some local elected officials are really tuned in to sea level rise, others are not. And then advocacy networks, like among disadvantaged communities or NGOs, trying to link together all the different groups that are involved. And I would say that, at the time that I wrote the original report in 2017, there's a lot of consternation about a lack of political leadership at the state level in California around sea level rise. There'd been a little bit of an intermittent thought, but there's also a lot of focus, and rightly so, on drought and water supply and things like that. There's not as much focus on coastal sea level rise adaptation or climate adaptation in general. And I would say that has changed actually in the last 4 or 5 years. Newsom administration has actually paid a lot of attention to climate adaptation, setting up various committees and executive orders that do things. And in the state legislature of California, we have the Select Committee on Sea Level Rise, and the California Economy revives itself. It's a legislative member organization. The Bay Area Caucus is paying attention to it. And here's a bunch of bills down here that are all fairly recent. Assembly bills, AB, and Senate bills is the SB. And those are all bills that have something to do with climate adaptation that are at various stages in the California state legislature. And now we have Biden in office, and Biden, as most of you are aware, has passed some very large infrastructure bills and has some emphasis on climate change and adaptation. So I do expect some federal money to be coming towards California that can be used for climate adaptation in coastal areas and in other parts of California around wildfires and water that will contribute to that. But like I said earlier, that while that federal money and state attention is really nice, and that action is nice, that's, how long that will last is always a question. One of the ones that I really like is AB 897, which requires the Office of Planning and Research, Governor's Office of Planning and Research, OPR, to provide technical assistance to regions seeking to establish a regional climate network and plans. So it's kind of like what Bay Adapt is. It's a regional climate network and plans. And now we have a state bill that's in process that can help provide technical assistance, maybe some oversight and funding for the maintenance and sustainability of such networks. And then challenge 8 is community engagement. Sea level rise has been described as a slow-moving natural disaster. It's not like a fire or a big flood that's really psychologically close to people. It's a slow-moving natural disaster. It tends to be psychologically distant. And if you look at this is from Maddel Mildenberger and I did household surveys in the Bay Area and asked people about their views on how much sea level rise would harm them personally, harm people in the Bay Area, harm people in the US. And you see that people's views on how much it would harm them personally. They think it's not going to harm them personally, but as you go out towards other countries, developing countries, or the future, that's where they think the harm is. So if they think the harm is not in the Bay Area and far in the future, that means it's psychologically distanced and they're not as interested in acting on it right now. And actually, if you look at these two graphs, these are people that did not vote for Measure AA, and these are people who did vote for Measure AA. And you can see that the people who voted for Measure AA do think sea level rise is going to have more of an effect on them and just kind of more harm overall. So that's one of the reasons that it's definitely not the only reasons that people voted for Measure AA, but there is an association there. And the other thing with community engagement is that you have an environmental justice issue in the Bay Area around sea level rise vulnerability and adaptive capacity, which disadvantaged communities are more vulnerable and have less adaptive capacity to participate in the system or engage in adaptation actions. And that's really something that occurs, I would say, in almost every climate adaptation issue around the world. And that community engagement and figuring that out is in helping out the frontline communities and thinking about the equity of sea level rise is a really important thing. It's something that's central to Bay Adapt. There's an environmental justice caucus and a working group around Bay Adapt, and something that we're working on more and more in our proposed SEER Center, our Climate Adaptation Research Center. And all of this is really crucial for elected officials. When I did the interviews, you're talking about, is a county official or a city official and who's an elected, like a city council member or a mayor or something, are they going to do something about it? Well, they have to have the community members and citizens saying it's a problem they ought to deal with. Oh, and I should mention with disadvantaged communities, when you have them dealing with a long-term problem like sea level rise, but they are also have these other intersecting problems that are much more short term and really take a lot of attention and energy. Housing, COVID, obviously, race, those problems really have a huge interactive effect on and are much psychologically closer relative to sea level rise, which just makes the sea level rise and climate adaptation problem even more difficult. Here's a picture of the vulnerable communities and the intersection with the Bay Area. This is from the Adapting to Rising Tides report that was done by BCDC as kind of a preliminary planning effort, preliminary to Bay Adapt. They did a Bay Area vulnerability analysis, and they've also supported more local vulnerability analysis. But this shows you where the socially vulnerable groups are. And then, for example, in Marin County, 37% of the socially vulnerable groups are exposed to sea level rise, and they have, under a particular scenario, how many residential units, and then contamination vulnerability. So that's also like communities that have a history of contamination where flooding may mobilize those contaminants. So they've done a pretty good job, in my opinion, in the Bay Area and BCDC of being aware of this issue and at least providing some analysis and trying to include disadvantaged communities in the decision making and deliberation, although it's going to be a long-term challenge. All right, so to conclude with, climate adaptation requires overcoming collective action problems. There's 4 types that we have identified: shared experience, vulnerability, interdependence, adaptation, interdependence, and policy interdependence. There's 8 core governance challenges that we've identified, and I think are getting some work being done on them in the San Francisco Bay Area right now. But I think the San Francisco Bay Area is headed in the right direction. But is it fast enough? Is it equitable enough? Paying enough attention to fair enough to those disadvantaged communities? I do think that these collective action problems are ubiquitous to climate adaptation. So when, for example, if you think about the cascading effects of a climate vulnerability such as wildfire, flooding, whatever it might be, there's always those sorts of cascading effects. So there's always climate adaptation is going to require cooperation and learning, and it's going to face probably similar governance challenges: how to manage those messy networks, how to get the money, how to deal with the permitting, civic engagement. So I think we're on to something fairly general here, but to really be able to understand these dynamics and how they play out, we need a heck of a lot more research, which is what we're trying to stand up, that type of research. We need lots of research over many different communities, many different social ecological systems, and we need to really observe things over time as much as possible with these big interdisciplinary teams. Then, and of course, all of that being co-produced with stakeholders, with a lot of stakeholder interaction communication, so the science gets better, and also the science can make a difference in all these policy decisions. So that's all I have to say today, and hopefully you found it interesting, and I guess it's time to take any questions if there are any.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a great presentation. We did have a couple questions that came in before that I'm going to jump into, but for all our attendees, if you want to go ahead and type your questions in the chat or the Q&A, then I'll be happy to ask them of Mark. So one of the questions that came in is, you sort of actually even in the middle of the presentation at the end, you touched on the question of, are things moving fast enough? Bill Lycum asked, do we have enough time given the rate of polar ice cap meltdowns to do what is needed? How do we know? From what he's seen at the edge of the SF Bay, we're behind schedule and seem to be in catch-up mode. So how do we apply these methods for that catch-up?
Well, I mean, I would agree that in a lot of places, we are probably behind. There are places that are ahead of us, I would say, in San Francisco Bay, places like New York, New Jersey, so that those triggering events of extreme climate events have sped things up in some places. Places like the Netherlands, which of course have been dealing with sea level rise for centuries, that are able to get things done a little more quickly. So I would agree we probably are behind with green infrastructure. I think that being behind from a time perspective is even more crucial, because if you're going to restore wetlands, it takes a while for those wetlands to establish and provide the benefits that they might from a coastal processes perspective. So if sea level rise goes faster than the wetlands are able to establish, that's going to be problems. So I think to speed things up, I think what the benefits of this work is identifying what those governance challenges are and providing targets that people can really focus on. So there's 7 or 8 governance challenges, depending how you want to look at it. And we know, like in Bay Adapt, we keep coming back to those and focusing on them. So that's what I think the benefit of this work is. And the other benefit of it is, I think, for decision makers, is that there's been a lot of discussion, we got to do things as a region. Now we have good scientific evidence of why that's the case. We know and have modeled those interdependencies. So it's no longer just a fantasy that we ought to act regionally. We see the evidence that what one actor does has effects for everybody else. So we better start working on this together. It should no longer be a question about just one city or one special district just save themselves as best they can. Let's think about this collaboratively.
Great, thank you. Rebecca Long has a follow-up question to that. Sort of, is there a best practice model that the Bay Area can follow for determining roles and responsibilities across the various public agencies quickly? Because speed, it makes people nervous of moving too fast and forgetting to consult the correct people that this is affecting.
Yeah, so I think that Bay Adapt and other regional planning processes that establish kind of a vision and a set of action items can help with that. Lots of us are pushing in Bay Adapt to, here there's kind of going to end up being there's a joint platform with a set of objectives and a set of actions to be taken. And for those actions, it's like, here's the different agencies or different actors that have the resources and the tools that are needed to take those actions. And here's what we would point at as some of the best available science. And hopefully that, kind of reduces the transaction costs they're needed, and also provides local governments a mechanism for accountability. So you can say, like, look, here's a regional vision. We are doing the things to try to achieve that regional vision, and the role that it sets out for various local governments, going through the planning efforts, putting in the projects as best we can. And then that accountability, if you have advocacy groups or political participation by community members in local elected processes, they can look, hey, there's a regional thing that says what you should be doing, why you should, we're going to hold, if you don't do it, we're going to get angry and we're going to go ahead and complain at the local level or vote you out of office. So that accountability, I think, is one of the things you got to look at as a tool to try to get all of the actors to try to go forward with what the plan is, because there's nobody that's going to tell you to do it. So that the accountability mechanism is kind of, I think, the political mechanism to push on it.
Great, thank you. And just to sort of add on to that, Susan Eaton before had mentioned that she had dropped us a note saying that our Peace and Justice Commission is working to learn more about the climate crisis and what role we can play. Sea level rise is especially of concern to us since many of us live in Newport Beach or a surrounding community, and her Assemblywoman Katie Petrie Norris has introduced legislation on the issue. So she was sort of, I think, asking sort of what other ways can she encourage that sort of adoption of the legislation among groups that are saying, as you mentioned, that won't affect me in the next 10 years or 20 years.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I think like connecting with legislative staff and the typical type of advocacy lobbying, but also all these blue squares I showed you in the network where planning decision making are happening at the regional and local level. Get involved in those forums, because that's where a lot of the network and relationships are developing. Some of those forums are inviting or trying to be as inclusive as possible. For example, Bay Adapt, like I said, has invited disadvantaged communities. I realize that that's a challenge, right? It's like, it's one of the aspects of a disadvantaged community is that the resources for participating in that complex system are limited. So you have to be, and you have lots of other things you like to participate in too. So that becomes a constraint for sure. And another thing that I think is really important is that the disadvantaged communities should try not to act alone. There's coalitions and networks of frontline communities that I think should receive investment. So investing in collecting that different frontline community leaders and frontline community groups across the Bay Area and forming kind of an overall coalition. So they're coordinating among themselves, and then hopefully that could be the target of legislation or philanthropy, and then using that kind of unified front to more effectively engage in those forums and more effectively engage in legislative processes and working in Sacramento with the governor and that sort of thing.
So question is, what are your thoughts about trying to integrate climate risk governance versus creating risk-specific governance approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the terms are that you're trying to get at there. If you're thinking risk-specific governance, like wildfire, sea level rise, different climate risk, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, it seems that is what Rebecca is.
Okay, so I definitely think that we probably are going to need some types of planning for each type of risk, in the sense that the drivers, for example, of wildfire are quite different than the drivers of flooding risks. So we're going to need, and the infrastructure solutions. But I think that the types of general issues that we're seeing in sea level rise, like these cascading effects and cooperation problems, plus governance challenges like planning and network management, I think they're the same. So I do think that the principles that we're working on here in this governance research that we're doing are translatable to these other sorts of climate change risks. That's kind of a hypothesis. It's right now, I think, anecdotally speaking, I think I would argue there's good support for that hypothesis, but we kind of need more research to do that. and with the caveat that there will be some differences, and that those differences should be enlightening in some fashion, like what's slightly different about, or maybe even very different about fire risk governance versus sea level rise governance. For example, one example I would say with wildfire risk is that you have these extreme events that happen really quick, that require a lot of command and control in the response to fire risk. So it's like a lot of planning. It looks like sea level rise risk, but when a fire hits, everything becomes very hierarchical because you have to deploy assets in a very coordinated and directed manner.
Great, thank you. We have another question come in that is asking, how does political accountability happen fast enough if there are so many residents that don't perceive sea level rise as a threat to them, still dealing with ill-planned projects along the edges of the bay by local planning entities whose response to challenges is that sea level requires regional fix and the local level won't change anything?
Yeah, so I think that is creates a requirement for integrated civic engagement strategy. I should have said that a little bit more clearly, talking about the community engagement aspect. Right now, there's some community engagement and science communication that's going on. Those efforts themselves are fragmented. So I think we need kind of a more, I think there's some folks from the Exploratorium that do this sort of work that are on this call. I've participated in their kind of science communication processes. But just like all the local governments doing adaptation decision making, there needs to be some coordination there. I do think there needs to be coordination among all of the different types of entities that are doing civic engagement around sea level rise. And I think that'd be a great target for getting those actors together and getting some foundation money or something like that to do that sort of thing, where you have multimedia, multi-channel messaging around this to try to get people to understand what's going on with sea level rise and how that links to the other issues that are going on in the San Francisco Bay or any urban area. So there's a new book by Faith Kearns just came out, The Heart of Science Communication. She talks a lot about the diversity of approaches that are needed to do climate communication, and I think that's a good book, and it's on my book club list to start with. I want to respond a little bit more to this question. The basis of the question is the state is contemplating regional climate networks and whether there should be multiple networks in a single region. I know, okay, I understand where you're coming from on that now. It's kind of this AB, I'm forgetting, 287 bill, I always forget the number, that I was referencing earlier, and these associations of regional climate adaptation networks. So I definitely think that I think within a region, having an overall network with subcomponents about the different risks is probably the way to go. So you have climate adaptation in general, but within that, you're dealing with sea level rise or whatever the other risks are, because there's going to be lots of cross-cutting responsibilities there, different agencies that have to be involved in the different risks, ways to get cross-sectoral cooperation, integration there. And I think you can have a tiered type of structure that would do that. I think that's probably the better way to go. And there was a lot of interesting discussion around this, around sea level rise, when I was, working. Well, I guess it continues, but I heard it a lot when I first started working in this area. It's like, what's your study about? People were asking, is it about climate adaptation or is it about sea level rise? And a lot of tension there, in the sense that people were worried that if you turn sea level rise into climate adaptation more generally, you might lose the focus that you need to be able to get something done and attract the right sort of political attention to get some resources to make it happen. But I think maybe with this new higher level legislative attention around a lot of issues, including state level support for climate adaptation networks, that it makes some sense to me to just kind of have regional climate adaptation networks that try to tackle multiple issues with some sort of tiered structure.
Great, thank you, Mark. That is that's a very useful, helpful answer. We are about at time, and that's all the questions we have. So I'm going to say once again, thank you